Everybody, it's a couple minutes past the half hour. We'll go ahead and get started. Thank you guys for the excellent session this morning. I realize the temperature is warm in here. We have contacted the folks to maybe adjust the temperature if possible. Sure, why not? To our online attendees, thank you all. Let us know if you're hearing the audio. We have one microphone for the audience, so for any audience participation, please do use the microphone so online can hear. If you need Wi-Fi, it should be the Hyatt Conference, SWOG 2022. And then I saw some restrooms out from the Grand Plaza down by the elevators. There might be some on this side, I don't know. There's some out there. So with no further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome our keynote speaker. You know, we talked this morning about doing a Merkel cell trial potentially through SWOG and how SWOG did a Merkel cell trial way back when. And when we think of these other kind of non-cutaneous melanomas, you know, non-melanoma skin cancers, things like that, we are thinking about developing some more of these through the cooperative groups. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Alex Shustari, who's essentially home for the weekend. This is where Alex grew up, not far outside of Chicago. And he is an assistant professor and attending physician on the melanoma service at Memorial Sloan Kettering and has done excellent translational and clinical work in non-cutaneous melanomas, including uveal, acral, and mucosal. And Alex will be telling us about a trial and some updates in mucosal melanoma. Alex, take it away.
Thank you.
You'd like to stand at the podium, maybe?
Yeah. Otherwise we'll all fall asleep. Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Patel, for the introduction. I think I know a few people here in the room. And yes, I grew up in Orland Park, Illinois. If anyone's from the area, probably not. I'm a proud White Sox fan, which means I'm depressed all the time. If you're into baseball. Anyway, so most of the work I do, I work with Dr. Patel here, so thank you for all the collaborations. And I'd like to give you guys a snapshot of how I think about one corner of our disease sandbox, mucosal melanoma. So I'll be telling you, I think a lot of what you already know, but hopefully sort of a fresh perspective on sort of the fierce urgency of now, both looking at it from a purely advanced perspective, then a localized perspective, which by the end of the talk, maybe I'll convince you is essentially the same thing, and highlighting some opportunities for clinical trials and collaborations, highlighting where others are doing some good work a little bit as well. My disclosures probably most notably with BMS and also Google the up-to-date Intro to Immunotherapy article. I think I get like 0.01 cents every time someone clicks on the immunotherapy article there. So those are probably the most relevant ones. So why is mucosal particularly therapeutically challenging? I think there are a few main reasons. Here is a patient of mine, and you can imagine that local therapy with surgery would be uniquely disfiguring, even for a relatively localized primary lesion. And similarly, local recurrences, as I'll actually show you with this patient later, are uniquely burdensome, whether they're periurethral, periclitoral, they are involving the sphincter of the urinary bladder or the sphincter for the rectum, and certainly in the base of skull, they can even be life-threatening. They have a worse prognosis, even when they're localized. So this is one of many retrospectives looking at rectal melanoma in this case. It would be the same for vaginal. It would be the same for a head and neck mucosal melanoma. That this is, of course, in the pre-PD-1 era. But it isn't a huge amount better nowadays. It's a little bit better. But even when you're localized, you tell a patient how high risk this is, and they look at you like you're crazy because they say that, oh my God, I just noticed this thing, and they gave me nasal steroids for 6 months and told me it was no big deal, and now you're telling me all this scary stuff. Even this is mostly from the IPI era. This is a MSK retrospective. We looked at our institution's experience from the time of distant metastasis, and still found, that mucosals did a bit worse. And I'm trying to find a fellow to do this again now that it's been 6 years. I suspect we will show actually quite a similar trend that mucosal does worse even when you're at the metastatic level getting PD-1 blockade. In contrast to cutaneous and unknown primary melanomas, where about half of people have a BRAF/MEK as their backup plan, and now increasingly some RAF dimer stuff for NRAS. Relatively few in mucosal have this built-in backup plan. And then, of course, and that's what I'll spend most of our time talking about, there really is no consensus for exactly how to treat these folks. So this is the follow-up data from Checkmate 238. This was, as I'll mention, the only adjuvant trial that involved PD-1 blockade so far that allowed mucosals with node-positive disease. And you can see it was a whopping, actually I didn't put the numbers there, 29 patients across that trial. And, can't make heads or tails of whether IPI or Nivo are better. And you really can't even say what the recurrence-free survival is, what percent really are cured. It's all really, really difficult to tell when you're basing an entire decision of PD-1 blockade, in this case in the adjuvant setting, on less than 30 people. So we've made some progress, just not as much as in cutaneous melanoma. So we need dedicated mucosal melanoma trials. Big coincidence, I've heard that you guys do trials, and that is why I'm here. So starting off, how do we treat a patient with advanced disease? So we know how to treat a patient with advanced disease, certainly in the cutaneous setting. So on the left-hand side, we know that when you look at disease-specific survival, you really see, more than half of people in the clinical trial setting are effectively cured. That latest melanoma-specific survival was really not budging at all after around 4 years. And, we have some lovely clinical data coming from the Australian, collaborative retrospective saying if you've got lung mets and you've got, fewer than 3 sites and other things, like you're doing great. Lung and bone are worse. There's a lot of sort of robust data. In mucosal, on the other hand, we really don't actually even know what CTLA-4 blockade does in the PD-1 setting. And if that sounds like I'm wrong, I will show you why I think I'm not wrong on that. And there really are no biomarkers for patient selection. Even PD-L1 is arguably not great in this disease. And in my opinion, as a clinician who sees a fair number of these folks, VEGF receptor blockade is certainly promising. It's just been difficult for me to get for my patients. So you will say, we know that Ipi-Nivo is better than Nivo alone. We know it from this randomized paper. It was D'Angelo et al. It was 2017. But unfortunately, this is just one sort of retrospective analysis of one prospective trial, and it was about 80-something total patients. So we published this update right in the beginning of COVID, the first virtual ASCO, showing yes, indeed, there's a more modest PFS benefit when you compare mucosal on the left with the red Ipi-Nivo bar. It looks higher than the green Nivo bar. And they both do worse than in cutaneous. Certainly OS was the same thing. If anything, PFS and OS are much more tightly linked in mucosal. If I go back one slide, you can see that if you progress in cutaneous melanoma, it's not necessarily correlated with your risk of dying as much, but in mucosal, it's still very tightly related. So 29 and 14, you look, it's 36 and 17. These are in small groups, so it's literally like most people who progressed eventually died on this follow-up. But more recently, there was a large retrospective where they pooled about, I don't know, 500 people, whatever it is here, close to 550 people, of whom 200 got some form of CTLA-4. Now, it might have been 1 milligram per kilogram of IPI, it might have been 3, but I don't think it's a huge difference. And interestingly, in the paper, I was only a co-author. They didn't include how many got IPI-1 or IPI-3, which I think is sort of strange, but I don't think we can brush this off and say, well, it's too heterogeneous. I think this is, double the number of people, and in fact, over double the number of people that we've ever had before. And I think these curves are superimposable. Now, what do you do? Okay, frontline, Nivo, maybe you give Nivo-IPI, maybe you give, something else. In cutaneous melanoma, we already talked about the BRAF/MEK backup plan that, quite a substantial minority of patients have. And then we can all agree, rightly or wrongly, there's this sort of endless stream of like phase 1 alphabet soup studies that they all want to be second or third, and they all want you to put your patient directly on that trial without any intervening therapy, and they want them to be ECOG 0 and all that. So there are a number of other opportunities for patients with mucosal melanoma. There's also, and I'll show you the curve, this sort of intermediate, and those of you who are on the NCCN committees have put, lenvatinib pembro on the latest version, not specifically for cutaneous melanoma, but it's under the guidelines of cutaneous melanoma. Uveal has their own NCCN, and then mucosal is sort of left in the cold, kind of, or grouped in with cutaneous. So it's easier to get it, in my experience, for cutaneous melanoma. And then you contrast it again. For patients with mucosal, it's fewer with BRAF/MEK as an option. KIT, is hit or miss. If you're exon 11, L576P mutant, you have a pretty good chance of responding to KIT for a while. But if you have, other exons, of which about half are other exons, you really don't tend to respond very well to imatinib. There really are, to my knowledge, like dedicated mucosal trials post PD-1. Right now, there's really just one, nemvaleukin. There are some others that are allowing, mucosal involvement, which is nice. And like I said, there's not as easy of an access. We've tried to look into, most of them being BRAF V600 wild type, what the other drivers are. The big sort of gaping, need in this targeted therapy is for NF1 directed therapy. So I'm still trying to find a way to package these data in an interesting way. No one cares to see these types of mutational papers anymore. So I'm trying to link it with some biomarkers and stuff. You can go ahead and scoop me at this point. I've had like 5 years to publish this, and I've just been a little bored about showing that it's NF1 deletions. So if your patient with mucosal is BRAF V600 wild type and RAS wild type, and you asked yourself, what driver do they have? Is it relevant? They probably have NF1 loss. The other thing that is sometimes relevant is they can have HER2 amplifications. I'm particularly excited about that because of, I forget the generic name, but like the Enhertu drug, like the better. Can you hear me? Oh my God. Okay, you can hear me. All right. I'm excited about some of the better HER2-directed therapies nowadays. May become relevant for not just mucosal, it could be acral, a little less often cutaneous. So I'm a big advocate for sort of broad genetic testing, particularly if they're V600 wild type and they're PD-1 resistant. The big sort of break in the last 5 years came from Dr. Gu's group in Beijing that enrolled about 30 patients with mostly, but not entirely, mucosal melanoma. They had a couple of unknown primaries in there, and showed that just under half of them had an objective response. Now, many of you have also seen the pembro and lenvatinib data that was just published, showing a pretty nice response rate as well. I didn't show the durability plots, they're not quite as durable as we expect for a traditional like PD-1. If you respond, you're almost always going to, keep that response for quite a while, which tells me that some of the VEGFR is really driving sort of a TKI type response. It's not necessarily as durable as a purely like immune surveillance type response, but nonetheless, a really useful clinical tool. Where do we go from here? I think is, we have to take it a few different ways. We've got a long way to go. I think one of the key questions is, can we replicate the phase 2 success of PD-1 and axitinib? In that case, it was toripalimab as the PD-1. I don't think the PD-1 drug matters all that much, but PD-1 blockade plus axitinib in a more sort of, geographically, ethnically diverse population. What do we do for patients who progress on PD-1 based therapy? And I think globally, sort of how do we get better at advancing frontline therapy? I think, for good reason, China's been leading the way because they're more centralized. They have fewer melanomas in general, but they're obviously a larger country. And when you do get melanoma at a certain socioeconomic status, you sort of get on a train to Beijing and often enroll on a trial at much higher rates, I think, than in our healthcare system. But our approach, at least for the first two, can we replicate this, and what do we do when we progress? I was fortunate to be awarded an investigator-initiated trial from the NCCN. This was in cooperation with Pfizer, giving access to axitinib. So the trial is actually a phase 2/1b instead of a 1b/2, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. So we aim to just replicate the response rates that were promising versus not promising from PD-1 monotherapy, which is 22-ish% response rate, to the response rate seen in the axitinib toripalimab trial, which was 48%. And to do that, you enroll 20 patients, nice small single-center trial for a rare disease on a shoestring budget, and you give them nivo and axitinib, and you sit back, relax, and watch half your patients be cured, hopefully, probably not. And then we'll see when they progress. What I was excited about was, what would I want to do? I would probably want to add in ipilimumab anyway, if they had diffuse progression. But those of us who've treated mucosal know that sometimes it is just a horrible localized primary, and sometimes you just want to zap the thing and you can get kind of a nice, salvage response, sometimes even a CR to, stereotactic body radiation. So the phase 1b part is saying, as long as you didn't have toxicity, you could either get IPI-1 added in, or you could get SBRT. And so take the same 20 patients and give them 2 shots on goal, give them nivo axitinib, and then either give them radiation or IPI. And the endpoints for the second part of the trial are pure safety endpoints, because nivo IPI axitinib has been given in renal cell carcinoma, not without some toxicity, as it turns out. So we'll see how it goes in a mucosal population. And then, anytime you radiate a viscous surface with something like a VEGF, inhibitor, there's always a possibility that you'll, get a life-threatening bleed or something, or perforate. Those things would be bad. And we'd want to know in 10 patients if we're offering them something that's just way too toxic. So, sorry, I should have flipped as I walked you through this to this in Word form. So far, we've just enrolled our third patient. It's been open about 6 months. I think I'll enroll it before I quit my job. So I'm excited about it. Yeah, my other job is being a stand-up comedian, obviously. So working on it. But unfortunately, because, and I'm just sort of learning as I go with these IITs, Pfizer has some interesting rules. Are we fairly like a small group? Can I speak candidly?
You have 30 people online.
Do they work for Pfizer, as far as we know? Okay, Pfizer is, it's possible. Okay, Pfizer is a wonderful company, but they have some very strict contract rules, and they have this rule, and I'll just tell you quickly, and 5 of you already know this and are saying, like, get on with it. But they basically said anything you put in your protocol is now Pfizer IP. And so if you had this cool idea, like we sort of do, about why some mucosals respond and others don't, if I say a pre-specified translational aim in this protocol, they could theoretically claim that it was theirs all along. And so my lab collaborator, who does not really like that idea of having their ideas stolen for no reason for a 20-patient trial, we argued back and forth, and in the end, we had to take out literally all correlates on this trial in the trial itself. And then we're doing a parallel biospecimen protocol that just happens to be for mucosal patients that just might happen to get VEGF PD-1 blockade. So it's sort of this like unusual sort of background. So anyway, for those of you that get this paper in like 3 years to review, don't hit me too hard on why I haven't pre-specified these these as exploratory aims. There are, of course, other things other than just what I'm doing. Our colleagues in China, as always, are sort of leading the way with some innovative stuff. PD-1, nab-paclitaxel, and CD40 agonism is open. PD-1 VEGF-R in a couple of different forms is also open. These are larger trials. Our colleagues in Australia are doing a neoadjuvant trial fairly soon. And then in the US, I'd love to hear from anyone from Colorado, anyone who's involved with the decitabine trial and sort of the data behind that. I find that interesting. Now, to turn to localized disease. So this is this patient on the left that I showed you. This patient actually was treated with Ipi/Nivo and RT and had a CR. And then it turned out, unfortunately, about a year later, they had this local recurrence on the right. The local recurrence infiltrated their CSF through direct extension. And this patient died of a local recurrence, never ever developed distant disease. So localized disease can be threatening in and of itself. And then I already showed you the disease-specific survival that shows these folks with localized disease really are micrometastatic at diagnosis the vast majority of the time. Not always, but the vast majority of the time. So let's look at how we approach this in cutaneous melanoma versus mucosal. So of course, cutaneous melanoma, surgery is almost always a trivial matter. And we know that neoadjuvant therapy is superior to adjuvant therapy. If you can't get them in the neoadjuvant setting, we know that PD-1 and of course the targeted therapy option reduces the risk of recurrence long term. There's no known OS benefit, but these drugs are approved and widely available and sort of well understood. Now, mucosal, there's not a great staging system. Colleagues from China, from MD Anderson, are working on this, trying to sort of fine tune it. I would argue, in my experience, that most patients and even some physicians don't realize how high risk this scenario is. I find neoadjuvant trials to be relatively challenging, at least in the clinical trial setting, because if you have to, as SWOG 1801 did, had to define the surgery, call your shot ahead of time, and say, we're doing it at 8 weeks, we're doing it at 12 weeks, that's not a great sell for a patient. Let's say they start to respond and you're saying, all right, I'm going to take you to surgery and you're going to have partial craniofacial resection. I don't expect the patient to maintain, their participation on the trial. Same thing for abdominoperineal resections with anorectal mucosal melanoma. I find that to be a hard sell in my clinic, maybe because they know my heart's not in it most of the time for an APR. So it's difficult to do. When we talk about adjuvant therapy, as I already mentioned, there's not great prospective adjuvant trial data. And we know from a large phase 3 trial randomized phase 2 trial, that cisplatin temozolomide actually is the one thing that's had a survival benefit in adjuvant mucosal melanoma, and I'll show you that in a second. So once again, the 29 patients enrolled in the PD-1 prospective trial, the only one to date so far, really, let's remind ourselves how you got on Checkmate 238. You had to have node-positive disease, because otherwise you weren't stage 3. And then you also had to have a sentinel lymph node excision, which is not always possible or advisable for people who have a head and neck primary. It doesn't always map. Or if it's anorectal, for example, you can map it, but sometimes some surgeons don't like to do that. So this is really just a subset and a specialized subset of the high-risk mucosal patients. It doesn't even necessarily reflect the high-risk localized disease patient that we see in our practice. So I've asked about primary site. They didn't collect that information for Checkmate 238. They didn't really describe the patterns of local versus distant spread. And then the follow-up studies from BMS and Merck have both excluded subsequently mucosal patients. So this is the randomized phase 2 trial, again from June Guo's group in China, showing quite a remarkable overall survival benefit, cisplatin temozolomide over observation. Not much of a tail of a curve, unfortunately, but certainly the medians are much, much better. And a follow-up study, I don't show the depiction, but I mentioned in a bit, follow-up study actually dropped the observation arm and did a randomized trial of just cisplatin temozolomide versus interferon, showed that the RFS benefit was definitely real. The OS benefit was actually not quite meeting statistical significance. So I asked, actually, for those curious, I asked June Gu, I was like, what do you do for patients who don't qualify for a trial? Do you give them cis-temodar? Do you give them like PD-1? What do you do? And he actually gives cis-temodar, which makes sense. But if you ask those of us in the US, I would expect most of us would say, I don't give much cis-temodar. And there's reasons for that. We've published a commentary with Jason Luke in CCR after one of the Chinese trials of toripalimab came out, and we finally had some genomic data. And we said, why don't we look at, Dave Liu's data set from Dana-Farber on the right of the sort of, T cell inflammation score that was sort of readily publicly available. And we contrasted it as best we could with the Chinese data on the left. And it's a little hard to see, but for cutaneous melanoma, for cutaneous melanoma, which is the purple bar under the mutational plot, it's the second line. So not the gray and black one, just underneath. The purple bars are all like cutaneous primaries on both sides. You see obviously much more purple in the US-based data on the right, which kind of goes with what we know about what's rare and what's not rare. Then of course you see in China, what's rare and not rare is like flipped on its head. And cutaneous melanoma is much less common. And there's less, interferon gamma expression in even those cutaneous patients, less red than you would expect. And certainly for the, acral and mucosal primaries, there's a lot less inflammation than you would expect. So I do think there's some rationale for saying, well, a purely Chinese population may not match my clinical population, and therefore I may not want to use cisplatin temodar, even though there's a randomized trial showing OS benefit. I believe in PD-1 blockade. And I'll show you in a second, as we've developed this alliance trial of adjuvant therapy, just how rooted these notions really are in our oncology field in the US. There are some differences. I just think we have to then run our own trials. We can't just say, yeah, but that works in China. We don't know what works here, and then not do anything. You know what I mean? We either have to let them lead and follow their example, or we have to lead our own trials and say, molecularly, what's distinct? Is it the microbiome that's different between there and here? Is it some genetic factor? Is it both? So did you guys hear about this? Maybe you've heard of this study, came out recently. You guys heard of it? Anyway, so there's this awesome study that a couple of awesome people in this room have kind of led and put together, and you guys all worked hard on doing. And I thought it was fantastic. I mean, I can't remember, it's been a few years since I saw a result where I was like, this confirms what I wanted to do, but didn't expect. It was great. It's fantastic. So that this curve looks awesome. I think this is a difficult trial to do for the reasons that I've mentioned in mucosal melanoma. I think it's really, really hard to convince a patient that we are going to do a surgery in 9 weeks. And if they have a response in their painful, nasal, sinus, vaginal tumor, say, sorry, you're getting that pelvic exoneration we talked about. I don't think anyone would do that. In fact, if it were my family member, I would tell them to withdraw consent and continue the pembrolizumab until maximal response, right? So I think this is a little bit challenging to do. Now, if anyone could do it, it's the pedantic Aussies, I guess. Like they can do it somehow, great. I'm sure they'll build in some flexibility for the surgery that they'll actually do. But I think it would be difficult to do, at least in New York. There are still, I would argue, a lot of adjuvant eligible patients that we see. I think we see far more eligible adjuvant patients than neoadjuvant patients, particularly in vulvovaginal melanoma, where local recurrences are common. Gynecologic surgeons can excise them with some local effects that are quite unpleasant and a problem. But still, we could get some margins and see patients in our clinic that say, okay, now what? And I think we still have yet to define the median RFS, the median OS in the modern era, not for the node-positive subset that went on CheckMate 238, not those 29 patients. I'm interested in the 100 other patients that weren't eligible but are localized, recurrent, high risk. Can we stage more accurately across mucosal subsites? I think we are getting there. I think there are some good retrospective efforts that are really looking at not just Breslow depth, but sort of the relationship to the basement membrane, sort of like rectal cancer does, rectal carcinoma does. And then what is the actual adjuvant, therapy of choice? Is it actually cistemidar? Is it PD-1 monotherapy? Is it PD-1 and something else? So this is the story of what is now known as Alliance A091903. This is a randomized phase 2 trial of nivo with or without cabozantinib. And this is what I refer to as sort of a free therapy session for me, because I'm still young and I haven't learned this lesson before, and this was a very painful lesson. So I'm going to go through how we did this. So in June of 2015, my first month as an attending, there was an NRG call, so the former GOG call. There was an NRG call, and they were like, we want to do gynecologic melanoma, but we also just want to do more melanoma in general. We don't really do melanoma trials, and let's do a rare melanoma, like a vaginal melanoma type concept. And so they put in a call, and this was the original concept. At that time, Rich Carvajal and I sort of worked on this together. And the idea was, let's do neoadjuvant for 6 weeks, 12 weeks. This was in the Q3 week era. And let's randomize. I'm not going to read everything, but we'll allow surgery and or RT, and then we'll randomize to the 3 things that we think are potentially appropriate at that time, which was cistemidar, observation, or adjuvant PD-1. Now, look at how big that trial is. Knowing what I know now, having a little more gray hair, I would have never put this trial concept in. It's ginormous. And no one outside of Jungu could probably get this done. I would imagine. So it lost by 1 vote to a concept that did actually just read out. I'll show you those data. So it lost to a single arm, modestly sized nivo-ipi concept, and I learned my lesson. So then we went to the Alliance, and at that time there was the retrospective analysis of Checkmate 067, the data I showed you with Nivo-Ipi versus Nivo. Nivo-Ipi looked better. So we said, I have a great idea. Let's just give, initially it was 2 doses. People said 2 doses of Ipi-Nivo is far too toxic. We said, no worries, we can give 1. And we said, after that 1, you'll have your surgery, and then you'll go to observation, or we'll finish a year of nivolumab. Now, this was in 2015 initially, and you can tell why I'm so angry, because I still think this is a good idea. And I think by now we would have learned a lot. So what ended up happening? Well, CTEP said, wow, great idea. And, added some trimmings and things like that you would expect. We got approval. It took about, 8 months, 9 months or so. And then it took a few months to generate the study tools. And along the way, it was a little smaller. We sort of took some liberties on the statistics. Right before we were ready to launch, there was a trial that I've been talking about called Checkmate 238. And maybe you've seen the paper by Weber et al. In the New England Journal of Medicine. Now, positive RFS for adjuvant Nivo over Ipi-10 in mostly cutaneous melanoma, for some reason, led to, on literally the weekend before we were going to activate, CTEP to say, we are revoking your approval. There's no way to appeal. There's nothing you can do. And we got on a phone call and we said, this is unfortunate. And I was so upset, I actually didn't say anything. And those of you who know me know how rare that actually is, because everything I would have said would have gotten me, nowhere or even backward in my career. So we were on this phone call and the quote was, and I'll never forget it, the panel unanimously felt that it was unethical to observe these patients after 1 neoadjuvant dose of Ipi-Nivo. And we know now immunologically, now we knew back then, and many of us may have known back then, but they didn't know back then that you give 1 dose of Ipi-Nivo, and that is not a placebo, folks. That does not sit around for 3 weeks and then magically disappear. I am still so mad that this trial was killed off. So what ended up happening was for a year and a half, I said, I'm never doing this again. Like, that was a waste of my life. And being told that I don't know what I'm doing by people that don't know what they're doing with melanoma is extraordinarily frustrating. And so I said, I'm not doing another cooperative group trial. I do uveal melanoma stuff. I'm going to work with, Dr. Patel here. I'm going to do like smaller trials. But eventually they came back and said, well, other folks are interested again in a mucosal trial. And I was like, well, if someone else is going to do a concept, we might as well work together and revise a concept. So that's what led to, the one I'm about to show you. Of course, not without our PD-L1 vendor literally ghosting us, just stopping replying to emails like 1 week before the drop dead deadline. And thanks to the magnanimity of CTEP, they sort of realized, that they didn't want to let this die on the table. And so they gave us a couple of extensions. So here's the trial as is. It takes people with localized disease, and I'll show you what I mean by that. There are a few stratifications that you'll see there. And then the main part of the trial is a 1-to-1 randomization. It is placebo-controlled and no crossover. So CTEP felt pretty strongly that there would be no crossover in this trial to adjuvant Nivo, cabozantinib, or placebo. And then there's an add-on sort of third arm, because we hope that when you sign up a patient, regardless of whether they met out or not, whether you can get all the tumor out or not, we're hopeful that we can still treat them on trial and give them a VEGF-R containing regimen. So the hypothesis is quite simply, I'm not going to read it out to you, but we think that adding cabozantinib to adjuvant Nivo is going to be beneficial. And in my opinion, a TKI-style treatment like cabozantinib, axitinib, or any other VEGF-R is actually going to be more beneficial in the adjuvant setting than it is in the existing disease setting. That's just my personal opinion. And then we want to, again, show that Nivo-Cabo in the advanced setting has some efficacy similar to the statistics I showed you in the IIT and similar to the response rate that they found with exit toripalimab. So the study intervention is one year of treatment. In the advanced arm, of course, there's no placebo. And especially with 1801 now, the question I've gotten already a couple of times is, can you make this, or shouldn't we make this a neoadjuvant trial? Shouldn't this be sort of some kind of randomized neoadjuvant trial? I think that'd be difficult to do, as I've said, but there are 21 spots for essentially what is a neoadjuvant trial. Like, no one's going to tell you when to do the surgery, so you don't maybe get as beautiful a correlative plan afterward. But for a patient and for your clinical practice, I would view Arm C of just 21 spots as good a neoadjuvant trial as any. There's even some language written in there as to, resectability and your option to continue the year of treatment after surgery. So here are the statistics. We made an assumption that was very just out of nowhere. BMS helped us a little bit with off the record sort of estimates of what the RFS was from Checkmate 238. And I'm pretty glad we actually kind of hit the nail on the head for what we think is not a promising RFS. But it's a very, very big jump, as you can see, 10 to 17.5 months. Go big or go home. We don't want a huge trial that'll never fill. So, you have to be an adult with mucosal melanoma, and you can even pre-register for PD-L1 status before the surgery. So there's some pre-registration possibilities, trying to make it as smooth as possible. The criteria for high-risk resectable disease, I think this is very important to me and important clinically, that you don't just say, well, what's the stage? Because there really isn't a stage. And, oh, you have to have regional spread. Well, what does that mean when sentinel lymph node excisions are not even universal in this disease? So we came up with these criteria. Any regional or satellotosis is allowed. And then for sinonasal, most of the sites you're in off the bat because they're that high risk. For just pure oral cavity or pure like mons pubis, like vulvar, not internal vaginal, you have to have a certain depth. And so that's where that specifically comes from, because those can do a little bit better than the other sites. And then any of that happens, you have surgery and it comes back, you can have surgery again and then be eligible, because of course you've proven that in your body, your mucosal melanoma is high risk enough. It's already come back once. I'm not going to read through all of these. This is sort of your typical sort of timelines, except to highlight that adjuvant radiation is allowed, certainly for certain areas like head and neck mucosals. They often do get adjuvant RT. We do allow prior chemo and interferon. We do not, for obvious reasons, allow prior PD-1 blockade. For the unresectable arm, there's no placebo, obviously. You do have to have RECIST measurable disease. I originally didn't want that, but CTEP said, hey, you can't just run a 21 patient third arm without any stats. What about things like response rate? And I was like, oh, okay. So you have to have RECIST measurable disease, which is going to exclude some patients, but hopefully not too many. So we need your help. I think I appreciate the invitation. I think this is a big reason I'm here. We've enrolled one patient nationally so far. It's a patient in my clinic. I gave the ICF to a second patient this week, so we are on track to finish accrual. I think I calculated in 152 months. So I'll hopefully have children in kindergarten by then or something, but we need your help to complete it. And again, I don't think we can just recapitulate S1801. We can talk about whether we need to modify certain aspects of the unresectable arm or whatever. I'm open to discussion. What's your favorite correlate? Let's talk about it. We could probably add it in and look at it. There are other adjuvant trials. So I mentioned that we kind of accidentally nailed the RFS in the non-promising arm. So the multi-center trial led by the Mayo Group just reported at ASCO 2022, so far just in poster form, that the median RFS was 10 months. This actually seems like a positive trial as best I can tell, because the median RFS that they chose as unpromising was like 5.5 months. So Nivo 3 at B1, nice. I think we're trying to do better. We'll see, obviously. In China, I mentioned the top trial already. They do have a couple of cool trials that I look forward to seeing. So one is the addition of PD-1 blockade to the backbone of Cistemidar. I actually think that's going to be a blockbuster result, if you ask me. I think that's going to be massively positive, sort of like lung cancer, where adding in PD-1 to platinum backbone has helped save lives. And then lenvatinib pembro is not yet open, but they're running that, as far as I can tell, as a single arm trial in the adjuvant setting. So I hope I've helped convince you just how dissimilar mucosal is in the modern PD-1 era. We've made some progress, but we need to make a lot more progress. And I think it's not enough, as I said, to just wait for the Beijing group to tell us what to do and then to sort of argue that we're different. I think we either have to just accept what they do and lead it, or lead some studies ourselves. So I think of the trials I've talked about that we're running, obviously the larger trial is going to be more helpful, defining what is the PD-1 prospective outcome data. I know a lot of us are doing it off-label. Let's at least get the RFS data, and then hopefully VEGFR blockade in the adjuvant setting is going to be effective. So with that, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation and your time and attention.
Yeah, we're open for questions. And if you don't mind, Jeff, using the microphone so our Zoom attendees can hear you.
So I hope you realize you're not the only one who's had that exact same experience with CTEP. So you really don't deserve to be felt so out of. One thing I've always wanted to know, not always, but do you know the makeup of the Chinese study in terms of where the sites were and how many were anal, how many were vaginal, how many were head and neck?
Yeah, off the top, I wouldn't claim to know them exactly off the top of my head. Because I've reviewed some of their work, I remember thinking this is a pretty normal breakdown, except they have more esophageal melanoma than I typically see. And it comes out when they talk about it as head and neck, vaginal, anorectal, and it's like it adds up to like 90%, and they're like 10% other. And I was like, what do you mean other? And they were like, oh yeah, it's esophageal. We see it, and I was like, I've seen like one every year, and they have a lot. So otherwise it is roughly that same breakdown that we see in the US.
So that brings up another point that you ought to consider. Esophageal melanoma, gallbladder melanoma, small bowel melanoma of unknown primary, metastatic from nothing. Almost all of these are, in fact, clear cell sarcomas with an EWS ATF fusion, and should be completely stricken from the record of melanoma, although we don't know what they respond to and what they don't respond to, because there always been, just like you said, 2 or 3 in a series of 27 and not broken out one way or another. But these visceral primaries or visceral metastases from an unknown primary are by and large all variants of clear cell sarcoma. And we need to start doing molecular testing to look for that and then figure out what to do for them. We often give them immunotherapy anyway. A few of them have some a mutational burden, but most of them have a very low mutational burden. On your eligibility criteria for the neoadjuvant adjuvant trial, you mentioned R1 margin positive resection. And it was something I wanted to bring up anyway. There's no question that many times with maximal surgery, we end up with an R1 resection. But what I find to be an incredibly commonplace phenomenon is that a fill in your favorite or least favorite surgical specialist, gynecologist, otolaryngologist, somebody goes in, scoops it out, there's melanoma in situ at the margin, and the gynecologist says, oh, I don't want to take any more out because, you know, it'd be near something that we want to leave, which is, of course, we'd love to leave everything, and it's just melanoma in situ. No, it's not. It's the invasive cancer cells at the epidermal margin of what you just removed. And when there is an opportunity to go back and get a margin negative resection, wherever it is, that should be pursued first, rather than just acknowledge, just say, oh, well, I took some of it out and I'll leave a positive margin because I don't want to go back. So it's hard to put that into the eligibility of a trial, but if you can say, you know, the goal would be, I would say it as an R1 resection is acceptable after maximal surgery, and at least encourage people not to leave a little bit of cancer at one margin when going back would eradicate that, because it makes a big difference. On top of that, then we find that follow-up of these patients. This is a constant issue at our institution, where I follow all the vaginal and vulvar melanomas for their regional disease. And they come back to me and I say, when was the last time you saw the gynecologic oncologist? They said the day after they operated on me. Why is that? Well, they told me, you have a gynecologist, you know, go back to them. It's like we try to get people back to the dermatologist. They try to get them back to the gynecologist. But in the community, they're not following for melanoma. So there's so many pitfalls in this disease, so many places we go awry. And these things, of course, prejudice our outcome of our trials before we even get started.
Yeah, I don't know that I have much to add. I think molecular testing is increasingly relevant. I will say that not all, at least at our institution where our panel MSK Impact is done on virtually all of these, they are molecularly distinct, and you can tell the difference between a clear cell, obviously with EWSR1 fusion, and you know, a NF1 deleted or a KRAS, you know, A59 weird sort of codon mutated melanoma. So that point's well taken. I think the patients lead us. I'm certainly not a surgeon, but if, you know, they're going to lose, you know, sensation and function in sexual function, you know, I think they have a right to say, does getting in situ or microinvasive melanoma removed improve my survival in the modern era? And I don't think we can tell them that it does if the alternative is a lot of pain, loss of sexual function, and that sort of thing.
Hi, I'm Victor Prieto. Thank you for the lecture. And what I wanted to mention is that not all those cases that are from the GI tract are, you know, clear cell sarcoma, because we don't find the translocation. Now, we don't know what they are, because if they don't have a primary melanoma, we don't know what to name them, because they are melanocytic and they don't have the translocation. So it's true that I think we have to be more clear at the time of this large series to determine if they are one or the other. And then one thing that is important, particularly for the vaginal, as you know, is that they may have satellites. So they may have in situ, the melanoma, invasive melanoma is clear, but if you take a biopsy a centimeter away, there's a satellite. Or microinvasion. We don't know exactly if it is microinvasion multifocal or if it is a satellite. So that's another reason why it may be important to get a clear margin.
Yeah, one other thing to say for those strange ones that arise from, you know, small bowel, for example. Recently, you guys may know, pathologically, there was a subset called like primary melanoma of the lung. And they sort of said, yeah, it's this big globby mass and it can arise from there. And a couple of years ago now, I think beginning of COVID, one of our pathologists at MSK was like, I don't think these are, I always thought these were unknown primaries of regressed cutaneous, melanoma. And because now everyone's getting BRAF testing, and at our institution getting a broader panel test, as I'm sure many of your institutions do, you can now calculate that UV signature, bioinformatically. And so there's this paper I forget which pathology journal it got into, but we basically just said, here are 4 primary lung, melanomas, and all of them were like NF1 mutant TMBs of like 60 per megabase, and clearly from a regressed cutaneous primary. And we've seen the same thing from small bowel mets. We've seen the same thing from gallbladder mets, and you can tell the difference. Now, could you tell the difference quickly enough for this? Maybe not, but another sort of, advocate for that sort of thing. And you can actually eyeball, believe it or not, a UV signature yourself when certain panels have said this is a UV signature, but you can even eyeball it yourself and say, is it a C to T, G to C change, where every mutation is like blah, 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 1709, whatever, like C to T. You can actually eyeball it and say, like, they don't have to tell you if your panel doesn't say that.
Thank you, Alex. That was wonderful.
Thank you, guys.
Appreciate it. Okay, we're going to move on to the rest of our open committee. I'm on page 91 of the agenda book here, and we're going to talk about our couple of active studies, and we will start with S2015. This is our MELMART study by PI Josh Mammon.
Great, thank you. Note to self, never follow Dr. Shastari in the future. Not going to be nearly as entertaining. So S2015, I feel like I've been speaking about this trial for quite some time, but this is actually the first time that I'm presenting on this trial since we've actually started accruing patients, because we actually activated when we were at the Seattle meeting. So just a little bit of review on this trial. And this is really part of a larger parent trial, as many of you know, called MELMART, which is based out of Australia. And S2015 is the US portion of that trial. So the rationale for this trial is fairly straightforward. There's heterogeneity in practice in terms of the margins for earlier stage melanomas. As you can see here, it varies by country, and the guidelines are significantly different. And it's really to better understand what are the proper margins, and in a sense, can we tailor the margins to maybe a smaller margin than had been done in the past. So this is just a little overview of that trial, which their pilot version of that trial was performed from 2015 to 2016. And there were 400 participants that were randomized. That was really kind of a feasibility trial to make sure that it was possible to do a larger trial, but this larger international trial is nearly 3,000 subjects. Just in brief, the pilot trial was not meant to answer the question of what are the appropriate margins, but again, more feasibility. There were some findings from that trial, one of them being that, not surprisingly, that larger margins were associated with more common need for reconstruction. So the primary objective of this trial of the MELMART 2 or S2015 is to see if there's a difference, or to hopefully show that there's no difference in disease-free survival between a 1 centimeter and a 2 centimeter margin for stage 2 and above melanomas. And there are numerous secondary endpoints, and I'll mention why not all these secondary endpoints are necessarily going to be relevant for us. So the schema is very straightforward. It really is, it's 1 centimeter versus 2 centimeters. These are for adults with melanoma, stage 2 and above. And there are some stratification criteria, which I think are incredibly important now, including one of the stratifications being country, because of course the adjuvant treatments can vary by country, with immunotherapy being available here and perhaps not in every country. The eligibility is as follows. Again, T2B or above. Cutaneous melanomas, you have to have the ability to do a 2 centimeter margin. So those you cannot do a 2 centimeter margin, would not be eligible for this trial. And life expectancy of at least 5 years. These are the exclusion criteria, one of them being that there's an expectation that a sentinel lymph node biopsy is performed. Desmoplastic melanomas are not included, and they could not have already undergone the wide local excision prior, obviously. There is an expectation that there is some quality control that is performed throughout the trial, including a photograph being taken of the wide local excision specimen prior to the wide local excision being performed, again, to really demonstrate that you're performing a 1 centimeter margin. If you say you're performing 1 centimeter margin, or 2 centimeter margin, if you say that you're performing a 2 centimeter margin. And it's very detailed, but should be fairly straightforward to the surgeons that are participating in this trial. There is also an expectation of lymphocytography. I know that's not always routinely performed at all sites of melanoma excision, but there is an expectation of lymphocytography on this trial. And this is, I'm just going to briefly touch on the calendar. And there is actually a video of the for the site initiation visit that goes through these slides in detail as well. There's also, and we'll talk about this in a moment, there is also recording of surgical AEs. One of the variables being closely observed is the number of adverse events from a surgery standpoint, from a 1 centimeter versus a 2 centimeter margin. So that will be important to collect essentially within the first 3 months per surgery. And these are events that can happen anywhere. These are not just events at the wide local excision site, includes at the sentinel lymph node biopsy site. So all adverse events are collected. And then the follow-up for this trial, it's mandatory follow-up for 5 years, but there is an option to follow these patients up to 10 years, because again, what we're looking for are disease-free survival or recurrences, so it's certainly important to follow these patients closely. So all adverse events are being recorded and observed, but I want to kind of focus on the fact that the intervention-associated, surgery-associated adverse events are particularly followed. And this is just a list of some of those type of adverse events. And again, these are particularly important to record because again, we're looking for differences between the 1 and 2 centimeter margins. And of course, there are serious adverse events as well. So just a little bit, this is a little bit different type of trial than many of our other trials because this is a collaboration with an international kind of parent site. So certainly there's portions of this trial that are through the CTSU open system, but there's also interactions with MASK, the international site as well. In particular, randomization is actually through MASK, and there is some data entry also on the MASK site. And part of the time that it took to get this trial open was really trying to make sure that that we had created a system that we could enter data within the MASK system, the REDCap system. So again, this is the online randomization is through the MASK website, and a lot of the information needs to be coordinated with MASK, and that is, again, a little bit different for your study coordinators and something to certainly look through the protocol to better understand. And again, these are some of the details of credentialing as well being important for the surgeons so that they can understand how to perform the wide local excision as well. Again, this is just really emphasizing that data management is through the REDCap system. So all trial data has to be entered in REDCap, which is a system that the MASK site uses. So there, I kind of mentioned that not all of our endpoints are relevant that I had listed there, particularly the PROs. I do want to emphasize that the main protocol has a really strong PRO component. We are not yet participating in any of the PROs. I hope to correct that issue in the not too distant future, but it is something that I'm working through and with CTEP and making sure that we address. Additionally, that we are hoping to have a translational component for this trial that is also not live yet. So those might be amendments that might be coming through in the future. So that is a topic of confusion, particularly the PROs that we're not participating in at this time. So if there are any questions about that, please feel free to contact me. And these are some contact information that you'll receive. Now, this is a slide I really wanted to get to, which is how are we doing? So activated in April, more than 40 sites open, and now some of these sites are kind of satellite sites of the main location, but 31 subjects accrued thus far. Now, what's remarkable about that is when our program book was printed, I think it's listed as 8. So you can imagine that the number of the acceleration of the accrual over the last several months. I'm very, very excited about how quickly we're starting to accrue. So this is the most recent MASK projections on what accrual looks like, and you can see quite clearly that that curve is starting to go up. And I imagine that we will probably, and I hate to jinx myself by saying this, but I wouldn't be surprised if we accrue prior to our expectations with this trial. And I'll show you some other really exciting information because we're all competitive, right? So our target annual accrual in the United States is 180. This year, so far, we have already accrued at the time of this calculation 188, which also makes us the largest country with the largest accrual for this trial, which again is remarkable. Now, that was all very exciting, but I will also want to fully acknowledge that most of that accrual has not been through SWOG as of this point. There are 6 legacy sites, and there are individuals in the room from the legacy sites who have done the vast majority of this accrual. But I really does show that our U.S. contribution to this trial will be substantial. But again, not being competitive, you notice that this year also, Great Britain has the most accrual thus far. Yes?
Is there a chance they're going to shut down the number of the accrual? It's not a research study, so maybe
Yeah.
sometimes in studies they do stop accrual.
Sure. So the question is, is it possible that accrual would be stopped earlier than expected in the United States? I certainly think that's possible. We listed or had projected that we would accrue 880 subjects to this trial. I have a hard time imagining that that we would get to that number anytime in the near future. Okay. No, it's 880 in the United States, 2,998 total. Yeah. So I'm going to go to our next slide here, and these are the sites. Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, I had a question.
Yeah.
You said that there were going to be additional measures added to the protocol for TM and PROs. Is that something that's going to be known? Because I mean, that'll affect a site that opens the study.
Yes. So the actual PRO, all the information on the PROs that we would use are already in the main protocol. So all of the sites, U.S. sites, also have received the actual full protocol.
Okay, so this is not going to be more than what's in there now.
No,
it's
it's
just
not.
that it's not activated in SWOG.
Correct. When we activated through CTAP, we just because of the amount of effort that it took to activate this trial and the complexities of this being an international trial, we tried to make it a kind of a bare bones version of this trial and didn't address all of CTAP's concerns with regards to the PROs at that time, opting instead to open just kind of the bare bones trial. So my hope is to that we can that CTAP will finally, if CTAP and us will finally come to agreement on the PROs, and we'll be able to use the PROs that are already in the parent trial. Right? And it's kind of melanoma-related quality of life measures or melanoma surgery-related quality of life measures. The 6 legacy sites have already been using those PROs quite successfully, so I don't expect that those will be significant burdens.
I saw in one of the slides that microsatellitosis is an exclusion criteria.
That is correct.
Would you be able to study for other features that are associated with a shorter recurrence-free survival, like vascular invasion, brain neuron invasion, and distance to margin?
Yes, so all of those are being collected, absolutely. These are the sites in the United States with the greatest accrual, and I really do want to emphasize that the sites that have the highest accrual are the legacy sites, so this is all accrual. The one addition to this is Spectrum Health, which all of this accrual is through S2015. So it's remarkable to me that of the 31 subjects thus far, they have accrued 16. And I actually should say they activated within like 3 weeks of the trial being activated through SWOG, which I'm very jealous. And so I want to thank everyone who's been involved in this trial, particularly Katrina, who I bother on a weekly or so basis about questions. But I really appreciate all of those who have opened the trial, the legacy sites that have continued to accrue and who are transitioning to SWOG in their accrual. and appreciate everyone's support. Thanks so much.
Actually, a comment about that Spectrum Health site. This site is a National Community Oncology Research Program site and was our lead accruer on S1801, having accrued about 23 or so of the patients. That surgeon is probably Paul Wright, if I'm not mistaken, who's done now half of our S2015 enrollment. So thank you to the NCORPS. Our next speaker will be joining us remotely, though we do have her slides here. It's Dr. Zainab Arolu, who will be talking about her brain mets trial and a recent amendment that will be processed for that. We're just pulling up your slides here, Zainab, 1 second.
Quick question, should I share my screen remotely or?
I'm looking at the AV guys now. Should she just share her slides? Would that be easier? Okay, yeah, please go ahead, Zainab.
Let me know when you can see them. Okay. All right, so I wanted to give a quick update on SWOG S2000, especially with regards to a proposed amendment we have for this study. So as I think most in the committee are familiar, S2000 is our study in patients with melanoma brain metastasis with BRAF V600 mutations, where we are randomizing them to a triple regimen of encorafenib and binimetinib with nivolumab versus standard dose of ipi/nivo. And the study currently includes patients with both asymptomatic and symptomatic brain metastasis, permitting patients on steroids, so up to 8 milligrams of dexamethasone per day to be enrolled. Also allows patients who've had prior neoadjuvant or adjuvant immunotherapy or BRAF targeted therapy, and the patients are stratified on whether they relapse less than 6 months following prior end of neoadjuvant adjuvant treatment or more than 6 months. And that has routine scans every 12 weeks and a 6-week MRI as well. So the objectives of the study, as a reminder, is looking at progression-free survival, and the secondary objectives include overall survival, response rate, and intracranial response rate specifically as well, using a number of different radiologic modalities, RECIST, RANO, BM, iRANO, etc., toxicity, and some banking of blood tissue stool samples for future correlative studies. And the eligibility, again, is patients 18 and over with BRAF V600 mutant melanoma with brain metastasis. All types except for patients with uveal melanoma are permitted. And again, steroids up to 8 milligrams of dex a day are permitted. Patients may have had prior radiation therapy or surgery for brain metastasis, as long as there remains one measurable brain met at least 0.5 centimeters in size or larger. If it had been radiated before, it must be growing in size. And patients can start on study after 7 days from finishing radiation if they did receive prior radiation for brain mets. And we do allow leptomeningeal disease, and again, do allow neoadjuvant or adjuvant PD-1, CTLA-4, and targeted therapies as well. So the challenge with this study has been, with a sample size of over 100 patients, as we've talked to various sites, and in terms of what have been some of the barriers to accrual, and it's been, some common patterns with regards to at centers, some of the other disciplines such as radiation oncologists or neurosurgeons may see patients with brain metastasis first. Especially, a new diagnosis of melanoma. Medical oncologists may not see these patients, after 2-3 weeks into their presentation. At that point, all brain mets could have already received treatment, such as, all of them could have been radiated. No one would have ordered BRAF mutation testing, which again is important or necessary, I should say, to determine eligibility for this study. And if a medical oncologist becomes aware of a patient, a few weeks after a new diagnosis of brain mets, and still needs to order BRAF testing, needs to get outside tissue, all of this can lead to further delays, and that can be challenging to enroll a patient into this study. So we have been working on this in various ways in terms of increasing knowledge about the study. Having said that, we do recognize it's not going to be feasible to do, to finish a 100-patient plus study at its current rate. So currently we have, I think, about 17 or 18 patients that have been enrolled. So in discussion with CTEP, what we have proposed to do is actually focus on patients with symptomatic brain metastasis. So the current design, again, allows both asymptomatic and symptomatic, but we would like to just focus on those with symptomatic melanoma brain mets. And what we would like to focus the statistical design on, and which we hope will now lead to a significant decrease in sample size, will be based on a couple of these studies I think everyone is familiar with. As we know from Checkmate 204, the data with ipi/nivo in symptomatic melanoma brain mets is rather dismal, with an intracranial PFS of only 1.2 months. You can see here 6-month PFS rate of only 19%, intracranial response rate of 22%. And then there was the recently published Tricatel trial, which was a single-arm study in brain mets looking at a different triplet regimen, vemurafenib and cobimetinib atezolizumab. And that study included a cohort of symptomatic brain met patients, 24 patients. And this is the PFS figure from that study, where their median PFS was 7.2 months. And they had a 6-month PFS of 57%, substantially higher than what the 6-month PFS that had been observed with ipi/nivo in patients with symptomatic brain metastasis. So essentially, we would like to redesign the sample size of the study. So currently, this is the current design, 85% power to detect a hazard ratio of 0.61. And I put, the corresponding increase in 6-month PFS, that would be from 55 to 70%, which would require, as the current design does, 100 eligible patients and therefore 112 patients. And again, the current design includes both asymptomatic and symptomatic. In our proposed amendment, which again, we have discussed with CTEP as well, and they have agreed in principle to let us move forward with this amendment, would be for a study with 80% power to detect about a hazard ratio of 0.41. And again, we feel that we can be more aggressive with this hazard ratio because we will now be only looking at patients with symptomatic brain metastasis. And again, these are not, we're still working on the final numbers here for the stats, but essentially we would need about 25 or so eligible patients if we only enroll patients with symptomatic brain mets. So, and interestingly to date, of the, I believe, either 17 or 18 patients currently enrolled, actually 12 of them have symptomatic brain metastasis. So we actually have a kind of, somewhat to my surprise, a 2/3 rate of symptomatic brain mets patients being enrolled over asymptomatic patients. So with the 12 symptomatic patients already enrolled, and if we're looking at 25 eligible patients to complete the study, that would definitely put us further along in our accrual than the current design of 100+ patients. And I'm happy to take any any questions. And again, this the amendment right now is in progress.
Thank you, Zainab. Any questions from the audience? Yeah, we have one coming to the microphone here.
Hi, Zainab, this is Ankit. So we have recruited 2 patients. It's actually easier to recruit to asymptomatic brain mets because you don't have to fight with the radiation oncologist that, that he's going to sap those. Symptomatic ones, mostly, I mean, as a medical oncologist experience, we get to know of these brain mets. First, the surgeons get to know of these brain mets and they try to radiate everything. And then this question of going back and forth comes around, like, is it ethical to leave behind that one brain met? I mean, of course, for the purpose of study, we do that. So I don't know. I mean, like, we definitely have reduced target. But how do you feel about, like, just keeping the asymptomatic ones?
So, I mean, my wish would have been to be able to complete the study in patients with both symptomatic and asymptomatic brain mets. But I think given the timelines involved in trying to finish the study as it's currently designed, I think it's not going to be feasible. But to your question about working together with the radiation oncologists, and I do agree that it does require discussion in terms of where the location of the brain metastasis may be, how strongly they feel that some of the brain mets may need stereotactic radiation, and is it okay to leave behind untreated brain mets? I mean, I think given that we do have some data with activity of systemic, with drugs in melanoma brain metastasis, for my patients, I am comfortable with them having not radiated brain mets and enrolling into the study, because the time frame is fairly quick to start them on the drug treatment. Again, it's within 7 days of finishing radiation. If the patients do undergo radiation, they will be able to start treatment. So I don't think it's too much of a delay in treatment. So that's why I'm comfortable with them.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zainab. I know it's been a little bit of back and forth with CTEP, but it looks like this is a good path forward. We have one other active study that's going on through SWOG. It's through the Immunotherapeutics Committee, and the chair is Dr. Siwen Hu-Liskoven, who will be presenting remotely for us about the Immunomatch or iMatch study that is actively accruing patients right now. Siwen?
Yeah, Sapna, can you see my screen?
We can see it with the shoulder view.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I just want to show a couple slides because
Sure.
I have presented a couple of days ago and then a few an hour ago. So I don't want to repeat everything. I just want to have a shout out of this trial to the Melanoma Committee as well, because half of the patients to be enrolled are IO refractory melanoma patients. So this is an attractive combination to use cabozantinib and nivolumab. It's a patient who have already progressed on anti-PD-1. There is no restriction of prior line of therapy. Other than uveal melanoma patients, all other melanoma patients are included, including mucosal melanoma patients. So, and the enrollment is pretty straightforward. It's just like a typical phase 2 trial. There is tissue submission, but in stage 1, the first half of the trial, there's no waiting of the results. So in the second stage, it can be a little more complicated, but I think the trial represents a good option for the patients. I want to hear if there's any concern about the execution of the trial or any comments about it. Yeah, thank you. And I don't have anything else to add to this.
Thank you, Siwen. Anybody have any questions for Siwen about iMatch? Patient number is the question, Siwen?
So 60 melanoma patients will be enrolled for the entire trial. Another 60 will be head and neck squamous.
60. Yeah. Thank you. So we're going to move on to our closed studies and just kind of give you a rapid fire update of closed studies. The first one, I'll just take you through S1801 for those who are not able to see or attend our ESMO presentation. We presented obviously our primary results for the first time. You've seen this schema before. It's essentially the same treatment. It's the same surgery. It's the same number of doses of pembrolizumab. We just sequenced it differently and asked if that would improve outcomes. So we used event-free survival as our primary endpoint, and that talks about events that occur before you make it to surgery, between surgery and adjuvant therapy, of which there are events on both arms during that period, and then events that we typically think of as recurrence-free survival events, so recurrence after melanoma surgery or after initiation of adjuvant therapy, and then death from any cause. We enrolled 345, 313 were randomized. Most of the ineligibles were just due to RECIST unmeasurable lymph nodes. Well balanced between both arms. There's really not much to say, but really the primary endpoint of event-free survival was markedly better in the group that was enrolled on neoadjuvant pembrolizumab. And if you look at the landmark 2-year event-free survival, it's 72% versus 49%. There's a lot of characterization that 49% is underperforming, if you will, compared to historical. There is no historical control for event-free survival. All the data is recurrence-free survival in the adjuvant setting. And so if you just redid this analysis for recurrences after the time of surgery or after the time of initiation of adjuvant therapy, these landmark numbers would be higher. But since we also accounted for events that occurred before surgery, this is event-free survival for which there is no historical control. I would argue this is the benchmark for that for future studies going forward. And then if you look at key subgroups, the takeaway is that neoadjuvant pembrolizumab was favored across all of the subgroups. It's always nice to look at the waterfall of the participants in the neoadjuvant arm. So what did their tumors do? Remember, this was stage 3B and up, so mostly lymph node disease, but not entirely. And you see a nice demonstration with just 3 doses of single agent PD-1. There were 9 complete responses radiographically, 56 partial responses. There's these 3 patients here. 3 patients, not easy to see, green on white, I see, with the crosshatches. Essentially, we didn't have scans on them, but clinically they had disease progression. And then 42 participants, if you count the number of bars going upward, it's 42, 30 of whom were still able to go on to receive surgery. And then 1 participant achieved a complete radiographic response and refused surgery at a follow-up of 31.5 months has not yet recurred. And so these are the events, and we had defined them as, not being able to get to surgery, not starting your adjuvant therapy, recurrence, or death. And so if you just look at the tumor events, where did somebody's melanoma go bad on this treatment? You can see here disease progression in the adjuvant arm, and then inability to remove all of disease, or you already had disease recurrence after surgery before the start of adjuvant therapy. And then what's really notable is that melanoma recurrence after starting adjuvant therapy is so much markedly higher, numerically higher in the adjuvant arm. So we tried to graphically represent this. If you look at the bright blue boxes, bright blue would be the surgery period, a little bit of the darker blue would be post-op, and then the light blue is the pembrolizumab periods, with gray being follow-up. And we dropped these lollipops down to see where the events were occurring. And you can see there was 1 in the adjuvant arm during the surgery period. This was a site who just couldn't get their scheduling together to take the patient to surgery. And then 20 that occurred at that post-surgical, I'm about to start adjuvant therapy period. 20 had already had disease recurrence. So if you look at the neoadjuvant period, there were 14 participants who had progression during that neoadjuvant period and had some sort of either toxicity or progression event. And then another 14 at that post-operative, about to start adjuvant therapy timeframe. So the same proportion of participants on both arms made it through surgery, but then look at what happens post-operatively. All those other events, essentially in S1801, are occurring in the adjuvant setting in the adjuvant arm. And just one slide on treatment-related grade 3-4 adverse events. They were very similar across both arms, particularly in the neoadjuvant period. They occurred in less than 2% of all study participants. It was an ALT increase that we most commonly saw. In both arms, the most common surgery period event was an infection of some sort. So I suspect on Melmart, that's what we're going to see as well. And in the adjuvant period, the most common was maculopapular rash. So, our summary is that, of course, it looks like neoadjuvant pembrolizumab should really be the new standard if you have resectable melanoma, stage 3 or higher, because it seems to improve your event-free survival. And, about toxicity, about progression, there are things we should do, I think, to look at those participants whose tumors grew in the neoadjuvant period, particularly those who lost their surgical window. And that will be interrogated at a Society of Surgical Oncology abstract in the spring, hopefully. And then that's really kind of the takeaway. And so, one of the things I wanted to acknowledge is just how many sites it takes to enroll a study like this. But neoadjuvant takes a little bit of multidisciplinary participation, and you have to make sure that you have a study that the community sites will enroll so that if toxicities arise, they can manage it. And with a low grade 3-4 adverse event rate of 2% or less, it seems to be quite manageable and well adopted. Half of our 345 patients that were enrolled came from community oncology research programs. So we really thank them for their participation. And we're on to the next stuff, which is looking at pathologic response, looking at surgical endpoints, et cetera, tissue and blood biomarkers. So thank you, guys. Let me see who's next on the agenda. Okay, moving on, we will hear from Ari Vanderwald, who just stepped out of the room, it looks like. Excellent. Yeah, Ari, are you there? You just wanted to present a couple of slides, I think. I can give a verbal update of S1515. Carrie Kendra is unable to join us today in person or online this afternoon. Did I say 1515? 1512. S1512 was presented at ASCO this year. This was our desmoplastic melanoma trial, essentially giving also 3 doses of pembrolizumab. The study has reported its primary endpoint. The manuscript is in progress, and translational medicine correlates are also underway. And an SSO abstract looking at surgical outcomes, absolutely. Siwen, if you're still on and you wanted to give an update on 1607, it looks like we are waiting for Ari to rejoin us here in person.
Yeah, I will just do a verbal update as well. I don't have slides. So the data analysis is ongoing. The analysis is a little delayed because of the other trials, but our statisticians, Shea Balassi and James Moon, and also our protocol manager, Tanya Johnson, they have communicated with the sites and get all the data cleared. So we have the final results. We're putting together an abstract to AACR. And hopefully we can publish around that time as well.
Great, thank you, Siwen. And we found Ari in his Christine Lottie moment. I was in the bathroom, Mom. He's here to give us 1616.
That actually happened when I was being announced at my wedding. I was in the bathroom. Did you text me too? Tony texted me. It's nice to know that so many of you have my direct phone number. Most of you have seen these data already. This is not substantively different than what we presented at AACR. This is the 1616 study that looked at the combination of ipi/nivo versus ipilimumab alone in patients who received, who had already progressed on anti-PD-1 therapy alone. I had disclosures. There was a really elegant hypothesis. The objective was to look at PFS. The study schema was to randomize 1 to 3 to each of the 2 arms. And we did biopsies on days 28 and 30, between 28 and 35, as well as at baseline. And then we assessed tumor every 12 weeks for 12 months and continued treatment until lack of benefit. Eligibility criteria are basically what I just said. The timeline just looks differently. We accrued all of our patients. It took a while. The subjects were mostly treated. 94 patients were randomized. Almost everybody got protocol-directed therapy. 91 patients got treatment. The demographics were well balanced between both arms. Don't you love when they say that and they like show you a slide like this and they say that the study arms were balanced across all major things? Click. So this was the PFS. The PFS showed that there was a difference. There was a little bit of a crossover at the very beginning, and more than half the patients didn't seem to receive any benefit, which is why there's no major difference between the medians. But the curves really started to separate out right around the 50% mark, such that we had a hazard ratio of 0.63 with a statistically significant p-value of 0.037. The 6-month estimate was that there was 34% of patients on Nivo/Ipi were free of disease at 6 months, whereas only 13% of those who received Ipi alone. The forest plot was on the right side, on the left side in this case. This actually has been updated a little bit. This is not statistically appropriate, this slide, because I just changed some of the numbers without changing others of them, so I apologize. But we did find one additional complete response in a patient that previously had been noted to have stable disease. The reason that we hadn't picked that up at first was because the patient developed a response 2 years after starting treatment, and so after the initial data lock. So we did achieve one additional complete response, and that actually makes a difference from the translational component as well, which we'll talk about at a different meeting. So the final response rate is 29% versus 9%. Takiao looks like she wants to ask a question, so I'll go fast. Best response looks the same, except we have an additional patient that's not on there. Same thing with the swimmer's plot. Post-progression therapy is totally non-informative. Overall survival didn't necessarily show a major difference. There were some adverse events on both arms. Nivo/Ipi obviously was going to be a little bit more toxic than Ipi alone. This is some of the translational work that was presented at ACR. We have, with Katie and Tony's work, this has become significantly more elegant as time has gone on, and that will be presented hopefully very soon and will be part of the publication. And so that's pretty much the summary. This was a positive study. It was a positive phase 2 study. It is going to be difficult to be able to do a phase 3 study in this patient population simply because, number one, this kind of definitively answered the question about whether or not we're going to be able to give dual therapy and continue PD-1s beyond, as well as the fact that most patients are no longer getting PD-1 therapy upfront alone. But importantly, this is the first randomized study in oncology that has looked at PD-1 progression beyond that PD-1 continuation beyond PD-1 progression that has shown a primary endpoint benefit. So this is a big deal, I think, in the oncology world. I'm not sure it got necessarily as much credit as it deserved. I would like my face to be up on Times Square, but it's not going to be, and I've come to grips with that fact. So any questions?
Even if they don't do Nivo alone, they'll do Nivo/Rela and it still works.
Yeah, I mean, we allowed patients. So the question was, well, even if they don't do Nivo alone, there are going to be a significant number of patients who get Nivo/Rela up front, and so Ipi/Nivo combined afterwards could potentially be a relevant second line. We allowed patients in this study who got PD-1 with something other than Ipi in front line. There just weren't a lot of patients who got combination therapy up front, but we did allow them. I think there were 1 or 2 patients who got Nivo/Rela. But again, I'm not sure that I can, based on the results of this study, endorse using Ipi/Nivo after Nivo/Rela. We just don't have the data on that. Tony might, but I'm not gonna.
What else are they gonna do?
So I want to know who was the biggest supporter of this trial.
You know, the worst supporter of this trial.
Do you know how many times I got up?
I just want to point out that Jeff Sossman could always do more. I feel like he was holding back.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment. That this is increasingly important in the Nivo/Rela era, because I don't know about you guys clinically, but some insurances are saying no to Nivo/Ipi because it's currently listed only after monotherapy. So if you give Nivo/Rela, some insurers are saying, why are you continuing the Nivo? They've already gotten dual therapy, and I've lost a few, minutes of my life getting, yelling and getting yelled at. And you can say this is a case where it clearly, mattered to continue the backbone of Nivo. But I would say Nivo-Rela does not make this any less relevant. In fact, probably more relevant.
No, absolutely. And I think that you can say, if you want to be really a stickler about study design, this included patients who had gotten dual therapy up front. The eligibility criteria allowed those patients. So you can certainly, I would hope, be able to go to insurance companies and say, this study included both patients who progressed on PD-1 alone, as well as patients who progressed on PD-1 non-CTLA-4 combinations. And say this is a positive study. It showed that continuing the PD-1 beyond progression worked in both of those patient populations. Not each one individually, but when you take them as a whole.
Put it in the manuscript.
Yeah, I'm not gonna. I should, but I'm not gonna. Anything else? This was a joy to be able to do this study. It was really an amazing privilege to be able to work with SWOG on building this. It was a long time in coming. For those of you who don't know, the first 2 digits of the number are the year in which it first got through CTEP review. So this has been a project since 2006. That's right. And so we came up with this idea actually in a San Francisco small room with Tony and I sitting around a table in 2014, and it finally got a number in 2016. So it's amazing that this was still a relevant question when we presented it in 2022, and it was really wonderful to work with everybody here. And thanks for those of you who enrolled.
Okay, we'll move on to another few open studies, closed studies, sorry. S1404, just a verbal update on 1404. We published last year in Cancer Discovery and then published the quality of life endpoints. It will be published in JAMA Oncology in November, so stay tuned for that. And the bottom line is that the quality of life was better in participants on the pembrolizumab arm than the standard of care arm at all time points. Did somebody have a question? No? Okay. And then we are going to move on to 2 of Alan Al-Ghazi's studies, except I don't see him on Zoom. Alan, are you there in the ethers? S1320 and S1221, I don't have any updates on these. So we will move on to David Lawson, who is joining us on behalf of ECOG and will give us updates on the ECOG studies. I do think CTEP is doing something different with their naming, because we just got a concept named as 2305 in year 2022. So something else has started happening, I think.
SWOG names its trials. It's not CTEP.
Oh, okay. You're right. It comes out of triage. You're right.
I really appreciate everybody hurrying and not showing up and all that, so that I would have plenty of time to go over these slides. I want to acknowledge Tak Gao, who is the SWOG representative on ECOG, and who prods me to do these things and to be hopefully a little creative in the slides, which I hope are coming up.
It's number 12. It's the last slide deck.
You notice I can't do a thing without them because I don't remember anything. Yes, all right, so this is our update on active ECOG ACRIN trials, a good number of which are also SWOG trials. Next slide, please, or if I can just do this. All right, wanted to start with the STAMP trial, which has already been discussed some here. And this is an adjuvant trial for Merkel cell carcinoma, treating them with pembrolizumab. And this is accruing really well. I don't know if Dr. Su is here. No, okay. And but it's 238 out of 280. Projected accrual, the completion date is February of 2023. And it's accruing well enough that, I'm sorry, start all over again. It is accruing well enough. There's also, though, an issue with the number of events not being quite what was projected. And so there's been some discussion, and that discussion, as I know, is ongoing about expanding the number of patients on this trial. So stay tuned. It may not be finished in 2023 after all.
This trial went down and included stage 1, right?
Without sentinel node biopsy, if they do not get a sentinel node.
If they did not, yes.
So I think it was actually very predictable that the number of events were continuing.
Yes, that's, thank you. That's a great, excellent point. All right, so I want to speak now a little bit about 6141, which is a trial of ipi/nivo with or without GM-CSF. Now, if you recall, this trial had a accrual hiatus of about 3 years, to allow CTEP, I think, to be satisfied that it was worth going on. Accrual now is 356 out of 600, and projected accrual ending date is November of 2025. It's accruing about 76 patients a year or so, and I think there have only been sort of technical issues brought up with this one, like the shortage of bacteriostatic water apparently is causing some issues about how to formulate the GM-CSF. I don't know, does anyone have any comments?
There were other issues in that the study did not allow COVID vaccine.
Oh, yes, yeah, yes.
And it took them forever to make the amendment.
Right. Right, that's right. Yes. Dr. Sussman is reminding me that there was also another glitch that the study didn't allow COVID vaccines, and it took a long time to get that worked out with CTEP and that. But yes, thank you, Dr. Sussman. That's correct. You're right. He can always do more. Yeah. All right, 6192. This is a biomarker driven early discontinuation of anti-PD-1. And the main biomarker is PET scans. And this also is accruing reasonably well. I don't know, Takao, if you have anything that you want to say about it.
No, I think it was slower at the beginning because it opened in the pandemic, I think.
Right.
But he just put out several amendments that make it easier to get the PET on time because it was very narrow before. So I think all those things will help. We just opened it, and it's just taking us a little bit to get all the automatic reminders. I think this study is different than other trials because usually you think about the eligibility at the beginning of deciding treatment. Here you have to remember while someone's on treatment, when you're taking them off to get the PET at the same time, at the right time, excuse me. So yeah, but hopefully the recent amendments will make it a little easier.
Yeah, the projected stop date of it right now is not till 2029, but I do think, as you say, yeah, that's before all these amendments changes. And I don't think that's an accurate number anymore, but that is what's listed in the ECOG protocol book.
That number, you're not going to have to change the stats, but change the protocol. Maybe there are statistics, but so I think
yeah. Dr. Sussman just gave an endorsement of the accrual rate, but acknowledged that the stats are likely not to change. Did I get you right? All right. All right, this is another neoadjuvant trial, and this one has had a long time. I think many of you are aware of this. It's EA6183. Leslie Fetcher is the ECOG liaison. Christopher Lau, I don't know, but at any rate, this one has only accrued 3 out of 42 proposed proposed patients, and it doesn't even have a projected accrual finishing date. And what's been the biggest holdup is the requirement that we have the thymidine-based PET scans, and just not that many people do them. And so there were reasons for wanting that to be part of the trial. I think people have just given up and are now talking about just using regular FDG PETs. And the idea of it, it is still a neoadjuvant trial, though, but it's with a BRAF combination. And I think, I hope at any rate, it's not going to get killed. You know, Jeff says it should be, but at any rate, I will present the countervailing argument that I hope it doesn't, you know, because I do think it will answer us a useful question about neoadjuvant BRAF inhibitors and possibly the role of PET scans in trying to determine early who's responding or not. All right, this is 6194. This is pembrolizumab in combination with CMP-001, which I'm not very familiar with, I confess, but it's a TLR agonist. And it's projected to complete accrual in 2024. It's accruing about 28 patients a year. Jeff is shaking his head. Yeah, well, that's true too. Yeah, I know, yeah. But people have been pessimistic about other trials, is what I think Dr. Sussman is saying, and but without validation. But at any rate, Dr. Tarhini, I think, is now more of a SWOG person than he is an ECOG person. You know, pardon? He needs to, yeah. Yes, and so. Bicoastal, don't worry. Yeah, bicoastal. Is there a pronoun for that? No, I don't know. But at any rate, this trial is also moving along. And then this is a trial, an alliance trial. It's a randomized phase 2 trial of Nivo with or without cabozantinib in mucosal melanomas. And I hesitate to say anything with an expert sitting here, but it has only accrued one of 99 patients, but it is just opened. You know, it is just open. Any comments, sir?
It's my patient, the first one. That's
Is that the one? Okay. All right. Well,
it's 78 accrual goal, to be fair. It's 21 add-on. The 78 is really what is the randomized portion. So we are a little closer than it sounds.
Okay. All right. Well, this is, thank you. I'm glad you were here, you know, to help us with that. And then this is another trial that, I don't know, maybe in some trouble. It's a randomized trial of dabrafenib and trametinib with or without hydroxychloroquine. It had the endorsement of our former president, as you know, but that's of a decreasing value, apparently. But at any rate, it's accrued 4 out of 84 patients, rather. But apparently Novartis is restructuring, and they're not necessarily going to support the trial anymore. And so, I mean, you need them to make placebo, for instance, and things of that sort. So it's not clear to me exactly what's going to happen with this trial. I don't. Janice, you were on the Zoom a while ago. Are you still here? No? Okay. Pardon? Yeah, okay. Janice, do you have anything to say about this trial? No. Okay. All right. And that's it. I appreciate the time and appreciate the invitation, and see you next time.
Okay, everyone, if there are no other final closing comments or anything else, thank you all for attending this hybrid meeting. It's a challenge to sometimes wrangle the live and in person, but thank you all for your attention. For those who are interested in joining us for dinner, if you haven't already RSVP'd, just let me know. Thanks, everybody.